recording, and we are now recording. So Scott, why don't you introduce yourself, and then you can launch into your presentation. And if anybody has questions as we go along, be sure to type them into the chat box, and I will prompt them to Scott when he's done with his presentation. So off we go.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this subject and the resolution. And it's not, we're not done with the process of responding to the resolution yet. And so there's opportunity for input and comment still. And so this is a good, an opportune time to talk to you all about this subject. So I am the National Wild Pheasant Conservation Plan Coordinator, and I've been in this position since 2016. I'm the first coordinator. The National Wild Pheasant Conservation Plan was written in 2013, and our plan partnership consists of 20 state wildlife agencies, plus Pheasants Forever, and the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, MAFWA. And our partnership formed to support policies and programs that benefit pheasant populations, pheasant hunters, and the communities in which they live and benefit. And if you're interested in looking at the plan or more about our partnership, we are at www.nationalpheasantplan.org. So that's a little bit about who we are as far as my partnership goes. Again, we are interested in policy, and so one of the biggest policies that, or sets of policies that influence pheasants is the Farm Bill. And so we're always looking at ways of explaining to people the importance of habitats and Farm Bill habitats, particularly CRP, and their effect on not only pheasants but hunter participation. So we gathered some data from our member states, some of our member states. 10 states had kind of long-term data with regard to their hunter participation, so we added that up. And most of those states, or among those states, are kind of the core Midwest pheasant states where we have a lot of participation still. And you can kind of see the relationship between CRP acres, which came on as part of the 85 Farm Bill, and what happened to hunter participation since then. So before CRP, we were losing hunters at a pretty good clip. We were still losing hunters during kind of the peak CRP years, but at about half the rate as before CRP. And then when CRP enrollment started to decline again from the peak, hunter participation really kind of fell off the cliff. We're losing hunters at a rate greater than we were before CRP. So this was concerning. It, kind of spurred us to action with regard to redoubling our efforts trying to get CRP, reauthorized and strengthened in subsequent farm bills. But it also kind of got us to thinking that, well, number one, is this a pattern that we're seeing in other small game species, upland game birds, and small game mammals? And if so, is there something we can do as a community about this long-term trend if it's more than just pheasants? And obviously our agencies, our member agencies are managing those other species as well. So we had a pretty good idea what was going on, but we didn't have quite the data we have for pheasants to look at things quite this way. So we were looking for other data sets for other species, and it's really kind of difficult to put this together. These are state trust species, and so a lot of the best data resides with the states, but there's no way to really put it all together into a national look at things. The one national data set that does exist is associated with the National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation that gets done every 5 years by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Census Bureau. And they've used similar methods since 1991, so you can kind of go back to the 1991 survey forward. So 6 surveys have been done. The last 6 surveys have been done in a similar way. So you can kind of look at statistics over time, participation, and other demographic information that the surveyors collect. So one thing to point out is sort of the definition of small game, and I mentioned a little bit, alluded to it before. The National Survey defines small game as basically upland game birds and rabbits and squirrels. Notably, it excludes wild turkey. So wild turkeys are big game, along with deer, elk, moose, bear, other large cervids. Migratory birds are what you'd expect, waterfowl and webless migratory game birds like doves. And then other animals are kind of everything else. And I kind of think about the other animals as the 3 Ps, predators, prairie dogs, and pigs. So those are the main game animals and other, or the main game animals in the other animal category. And so that's how the National Survey kind of divvies up their hunting groups. So these are the definitions that I'll be using kind of for the rest of the presentation. So most of you are probably aware of the trends in the National Survey with regard to hunting. And this breaks it down by hunting category. And so as you can see, there's a general downward trend, particularly as a result of the 2016 survey in most categories. Some categories were hanging on pretty well until 2016, big game, for example. But you notice that small game has sort of declined in every increment, which is sort of unique among these hunting groups. And so that's a potential problem. So if you look at this on a numeric scale, how many hunters have we lost per year on average? You can see that the losses, small game, at a clip of about 165,000 hunters a year over 25 years, sort of dwarfs the losses that we see in the other groups. And the reason why you can lose more small game hunters than all hunters is because, of course, many hunters hunt multiple types of game. And so a person can stop small game hunting and keep big game hunting, or switch over to big game or migratory birds and still count as a hunter. So someone looking at this, you could come to the conclusion that the hunting problem is largely, in terms of loss of participation, that problem is really being driven by the loss of small game hunters. And certainly we're concerned about the loss of those other hunting types as well, but the elephant in the room, so to speak, the small game elephant in the room is small game in terms of driving the boat of hunter loss. And the National Survey does break down hunting by different types of small game. And so if you look at these species and species groups, species group categories, no one is escaping unscathed. All the small game hunting participation numbers are downward, between 40 and 70% down since 1991. And there's a few things to look at here. Number one, the general declines. You also might notice that the small game mammals, rabbits and squirrels, participation is highest in those categories. And then the upland game birds are a little lower in participation, but they're starting to group up here in 2016. Also, all the groups declined between 2011 and 2016 except for quail. Quail increased in 2016, and it's hard to say exactly what is driving that. And quail is a catch-all category, both bobwhite and western quail. But bobwhite numbers certainly rebounded in the Midwest since around 2012 through the present, and so that may have driven that increase in participation, which is good. But if you if you look at those linear trends and you run those linear trends out in time, you can ask, when do they hit zero? When do we run out of hunters completely? And for small game as a category, that's in about 20 years. Rabbit, pheasant, and grouse, that's more like a decade. And squirrel and quail a little bit longer than that. So if we're going to do something about this, if we think there is something we can do about this, we probably shouldn't wait too much longer because we don't have a lot of time left. Now, we obviously hope that there's some sort of floor out there or an asymptote that these numbers or these trends will level out at some point, but I don't think that that's necessarily guaranteed, and the floor might be pretty close to zero or close enough to zero that those hunting types are largely irrelevant, or they're sort of boutique types of hunting rather than mainstream types of hunting. So most of us that have been working with small game for a long time have kind of known this has been running in the background. We've always lived with generally lower game populations. That varies year to year, but long-term decline for a number of species and long-term decline for hunters as well. But things can run in the background for quite a while and then kind of sneak up on you when things get dire. So we felt that it was time to bring this to the fore a little bit, this subject, and see if there was a community that could be formed to ask some questions about what could be done about this. So the statistics and the national surveys and what we put together for pheasants sort of bring up some key questions. Number one, can total hunter numbers be stabilized without slowing the loss of small game hunters? Can you have one without the other? Can the loss of small game hunters be slowed cost effectively? Is there anything we can do about those trends that we can afford to do? Third, will habitat conservation survive as the primary game management paradigm if small game and waterfowl hunter numbers diminish to irrelevance? So I come from the Midwest, so I have kind of a Midwestern perspective. A lot of our habitat management in the Midwest anyway, particularly on private lands, but on public lands as well, is geared towards upland game management, at least in the upland portions of those landscapes. It's something that landowners relate to. It's something that our traditional historic constituents related to. And so it was sort of, it was not a question of whether that should be our focus or not with regard to restoring habitats for those species. And again, in the Midwest, it's, with regard to big game management, it's not really a habitat-centered set of management concerns. Harvest management is much more in the front of people's minds and in the front of our decision making on big game, harvest management, disease management. Habitat is certainly there, but it's not the first thing that we have to work on with big game species, like it has been traditionally with upland game and waterfowl. So that's a concern. If we lose our upland game and our waterfowl hunters, what does that do to the way we look at our management responsibilities with regards to habitat? And finally, how will state agencies continue to fund small game hunting programs with a shrinking user base? And all these sort of are related to kind of the overriding question, does it only matter that people hunt, not what they hunt? So that's sort of the crux of the issue that agencies need to decide. Are we going to worry about declines in any particular category of hunters, or are we just going to try to maintain hunter numbers by hook or by crook, whatever they want to hunt or can hunt or we can provide to them? That's the best we can do. So that's sort of the central question. And in order to see how that question resonates across state agencies, there's not a huge amount or a huge number of outlets to ask that question. The one that sort of comes to the fore for most agencies seeking to kind of gin up cooperation on a particular issue is to work through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And many of you are probably familiar with AFWA, but for those who aren't, it's basically the trade organization that represents state wildlife agencies and our stakeholder NGOs. And so not only does AFWA kind of represent fish and wildlife interests on Capitol Hill, it also, as it says, works to ensure that all entities work cooperatively and collaboratively on the most important issues. So, what gets defined as a most important issue? So the agencies have a lot to say about how that's defined, and that question normally gets asked and answered at the subject area committee level. AFWA is made up of 33 subject area committees and 4 regional affiliate associations. Those committees are largely voluntary, but the people who serve on those committees are state agency staff, usually administrative staff, and they collaborate and discuss issues that need to be brought forward and action that needs to be taken. So one way to kind of run ideas up the flagpole is through resolutions. And so a committee can bring forward a resolution for consideration by the whole organization. And so that's the route that we chose to go with this issue. We brought a small game R3 resolution proposal forward through the committee process. The Pheasant Plan Partnership and many of the upland game folks participate in the Resident Game Bird Working Group, which is a subgroup of the Bird Conservation Committee. And this subject matter obviously called for not only participation from species experts, but also experts on the R3 side as well. And so within AFWA, that is most directly represented by the Hunting and Shooting Sports Participation Committee. And so last year we brought a draft proposal through those 2 committees, and those 2 committees agreed to work cooperatively on the proposal. And The draft was approved by both committees and brought forward to the directors for their consideration, and the resolution passed last September. So I think Kristen or Samantha put the resolution out as part of the call for this webinar, so maybe you've got to take a look at the resolution and what it says. But if not, in a nutshell, what it says is, it lays out the reasons for concern, basically, that participation is in sharp decline, that small game license revenue remains important to agencies. Small game hunting creates an impetus for upland habitat conservation. Our small game NGOs are important agency partners. Data on small game participation is sparse and hard to get a hold of, since it's spread out across all the state agencies and not consolidated. Current national R3 plans do not identify a specific need to focus on small game hunter participation, and achieving the goals of the National Hunting and Shooting Sports Plan is unlikely without formulating a response to small game hunter participation declines. So given all that, be it resolved that the small game hunter participation decline is a national conservation concern. So that kind of puts the directors on record that it's something that needs further examination and work. And number two, that the two sponsoring committees should present a prioritized list of key questions or issues and recommended steps for subsequent actions to the AFWA directors in a timely manner. So that's sort of the what we need to do next part, and that is to come up with a document that identifies those key questions or issues and recommended next steps for action. So to put that document together, we look for volunteers in those two AFWA committees, and these folks are who raised their hand or got their hand raised for them by their boss. So Hunting and Shooting Sports Committee, represented by Matt Dunphy and Michaela Rahi. The Bird Conservation Committee, represented by Sean Oldenburger, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Billy Dukes in South Carolina, and myself. And then Gordon Batchelor, the Executive Secretary of NAFWA, also has been participating. So that group has been working on a document called for in the resolution. And so these are the key questions and issues that we came up with, which is the first part of what was called for. Number one, given current hunter demographics and participation trends, how many U.S. small game hunters are there likely to be in 10, 20, and 30 years? So this provides an opportunity to provide some of that information I just showed with regard to how much time we have or don't have to respond to this issue. Number two, besides agency revenue, which is in theory replaceable, what else is lost as small game hunters decline? Is there anything indispensable that can't be supported through other types of hunting? So again, that gets to that, does it only matter that people hunt, not what they hunt question? Is there anything about small game hunting or, by extension, any other particular type of hunting that can't be replaced by the other types of hunting, revenue-wise or anything else? Number three, if participation continues to decline, at what point are current hunter-supported NGO contributions to state conservation programs likely to be compromised? So that question gives us a chance to bring in the NGO viewpoint on the issue and solicit input from them. Number four, how influential are game abundance and land access to small game hunter retention, recruitment, and reactivation relative to other factors and to each other? So game abundance and land access or hunter access have been sort of our two ace-in-the-hole approaches to trying to increase hunter numbers in the past, particularly with regard to small game. We thought that if we, made enough pheasants and opened enough land, that the hunter participation part would take care of itself. And if we go back to this graph and look at the hunter trends in terms of percent change per year, and look at how quickly or how much the pheasant population changed over those same time periods, we can kind of get a feel for how effective making more pheasants or less pheasants is, how dependent hunter trends are on game population trends. So if we look before CRP, they were tracking pretty well. They were both declining at about the same rate. During peak CRP, they start to diverge a little bit. Hunter numbers were going down a little bit while pheasant populations were going up a little bit. And then in about 2008, kind of things decoupled completely. Pheasant populations declined a bit. And again, the pheasant population trend data aren't shown on this. It's still the hunter population data. Pheasant populations declined at about the same rate they did before CRP, but hunter population or hunter participation trends really accelerated, went from basically stable to losing 18% per year. So we see this in waterfowl as well. Hunters used to follow waterfowl populations. When one went up, the other went up, and then they decoupled here in the last 10, 15 years. That seems to be the same thing going on with pheasants. If we look at access, in the mid-90s, that's when most of the Midwestern states got into their public access and public walk-in programs in a big way. And we've added millions of acres of public walk-in access in the last 20, 25 years or so. And despite that millions of acres of new access, we still see this decline in hunter numbers. So our ace in the holes aren't working at this point. And so it's an open question if something will work and if that thing is something that we can afford. So, okay, back to the questions. Number 5, from an industry perspective, why is there an apparent shortage of marketing towards small game hunters? Is the customer base lacking, or does the sport, compared to big game and waterfowl hunting, for example, not lend itself as well to developing and marketing new products? So that issue provides an opportunity for perhaps some dialogue with industry on the issue. Number 6, what legislative or policy changes could help mitigate or adapt to declining participation? The Pheasant Land Partnership has been working on a few ideas. There may be others out there, but there could be some changes that could help. And lastly, what interventions have states taken to maintain small game hunter participation? Which interventions have been adequately evaluated and which have proven to be most cost effective? So this is, the $10,000, $100,000 question surrounding R3 that you all are very familiar with. And I know that this question in some way, shape, or form shows up in a lot of different plans and conversations about R3. How do we decide what works and what doesn't, and what's most cost effective and what isn't, and how do we overcome the real difficulties we have in tracking individual participation over time. So this just reinforces that larger question. So those key questions were put together by the small group and brought forward in March at the North American to the 2 committees, and we asked for input from the members of those committees after the meetings. And We really didn't hear much back from folks after the meetings and after that call for comment and input. So I think these are sort of the key questions that we're going forward with, and so that's where we are. And I will return back to these questions for comment at the end, but there's a few other items with regard to the data in the national surveys and what they show that might be relevant to how we think about approaching these questions that I wanted to present first, and then we'll come back to the questions and the next steps and the opportunity for comment. So we'll be right back to these, but just a few more considerations within the national surveys. One barrier that sometimes gets brought up with regard to participation is cost. And looking at small game has always been a relatively low-cost way of participating in hunting. And so these are annual expenditures based on data in the national surveys. And as you can see, in all the figures are adjusted in 2016 dollars, so these are inflation adjusted. So as of 2016, small game is the least expensive way of participating, at least in terms of what the current participants are spending per year, only about $500 per year compared to $1,500 for big game. And so that's good news and bad news. The good news, or the bad news rather, is, despite being cheap, people are still fleeing the sport apparently, so that's not so good. But the good news is, the barrier is fairly low for folks that want to start or reactivate, and people can certainly come in and start small game hunting at a variety of different levels. On the far left there, those folks are equipped with basically the clothes on their back and a shotgun and a little hunter orange, and they're off chasing pheasants. People can be brought in through the dog ownership angle, and certainly that's been a big part of the culture of small game hunting for centuries, really. The connection to working with dogs, and that's certainly a way to bring folks in. And then, the opportunities for really pulling the cork and spending a lot of money are certainly there as well. And the cooler on that rig is probably worth more than the folks on the far left of the screen spend in a year on small game hunting. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to get involved at a lot of different levels. And that's been going on for a long time. This is small game hunting in France in the 14th century, a book on hunting methods. And you can see it, I'm not sure what the guy on the left is trying to accomplish on his hands and knees, but that's certainly a low-cost way of pursuing small game. And the netting of squirrels with a live decoy, that was a new one, but apparently the French were into that. And then, of course, the aristocracy on horseback with falcons. So it's always ran the gamut of highbrow and lowbrow, and that's still available today. So some other considerations, urban versus rural participation. And in the pheasant world, anyway, we always run into the problem where the pheasant hunting is the best within a state, kind of at the wrong end of the state. The people live on one end of the state and all the pheasants are on the other end of the state. And so how important is it to bring the pheasants closer to the people, or or at least to the urban areas, or should we be working more on urban versus rural landscape? So We know that the U.S. is becoming more of a urban dweller country, and that's mostly because urban residents have increased rather than rural residents decreasing. Rural residents are sort of hanging in there, not much change in population over time. And we know that U.S. hunting participation rates differ markedly between rural and urban residents. Rural residents participate at about 3 times the rate of their urban counterparts. If we look at how rural and urban hunters, their participation rate based on hunting type, with the urban residents, we can see kind of a uniform decline in participation rate over the last 25 years. Again, these are National Survey numbers. The small game line is maybe a little bit sharper decline, but certainly the other forms of participation are also declining among urban residents. There weren't enough data points in the other animals category to draw the line. But with rural residents, most of the lines are fairly stable except for small game. And so for whatever reason, it's actually the rural residents that appear to be stopping their participation in small game hunting over time, at least as compared to the other hunting types. And so why that is, I don't know. If you look at not just participation rates, but the actual numeric changes in hunter numbers, urban versus rural, and look at incremental change between surveys, the changes in numbers between surveys, you can see it's kind of a steady march in every 5-year increment for small game hunters, and that we've lost about as many urban participants as rural residents, or rural participants. In comparison, we really haven't lost much on the urban side for big game hunters. It's the rural residents that seem to swing in and out of participation, and it's kind of the same way with migratory bird hunters, although not as dramatic. So what does this mean necessarily? I don't know for sure, but it may have some relevance in where we choose to focus with regard to programs, our 3 programs, as well as access and habitat initiatives as well. And we know that demographically, urban and rural residents are not exactly the same as each other as well. The rural residents tend to be a bit older, and so it could be that they're just aging out of certain types of hunting, particularly small game hunting, more quickly. And so some smart person or group of persons can think about those factors as well in terms of what we need to do from the small game to respond to the small game decline. But anyway, I found those sort of interesting without necessarily a conclusion to that, other than, that's interesting. So, okay, last slide. Back to our key questions and issues. What do we need to do next? So that small working group of 6 now needs to assemble a draft set of recommended actions associated with each of the questions and try to prioritize those actions as well. We need to bring that draft set of actions to those 2 committees and solicit comments on both the questions and the actions, and go back and forth on comments until both committees are happy with the final product. And then we need to move that final product up to the AFWA directors, and it looks like that would probably happen next September. And then we need to start discussing how to cooperatively work on those highest priority actions, whatever they turn out to be. So that's what's coming next, and that will provide another opportunity for input before that final document reaches the directors for their consideration. So that's it. Again, we have plenty of time, I think, for some questions and comments, but if you think of something later, feel free to shoot me an email, staylor@pheasantsforever.org. So, Kristen,
Awesome.
That's all I've got.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great rundown of all of the details. There's a lot going on there. I'm really impressed that your group has been able to kind of parse those together and identify those questions. So there's some interesting discussion starting in the chat box that we can kind of go down some of these threads if we want to. But Tanaya Besky, she's in South Dakota, she says, I'm looking forward to seeing how this resolution could mesh with potential R3 multi-state grant proposals currently in the works. And I agree with that. There's definitely some marketing things that are being looked at for small game, like you talked about. And Jonathan Odell followed that up kind of on the marketing side by saying, most of the reasons I've been told why there's a lack of advertising and marketing in the realm of small game and industry, from industry and media relates to small profit margins on directly used products. Most of the money in small game hunting is in dogs or products like coolers, as you mentioned, none of which contribute to WISPR funds. So that's really interesting that just advertising might be considered less for small game hunting just because there is less equipment requirement, which doesn't necessarily play into those PR funds. But if we get people out and kind of hooked on small game hunting, that's a real gateway to big game hunting in a lot of cases. Definitely was for me. So I wonder, Scott, if you have any thought about that. Maybe should we be directing more of our efforts to small game hunting as kind of a gateway, or even just a way that people who may not ever be comfortable with large game could still be hunters?
Right. Well, I think the point of the resolution and the document is, to try to drill down into those types of questions. I think the answers to those questions may vary from state to state, from region to region. There's certainly much different opportunities for small game hunting as you go, west to east across the country in terms of game abundance and public land, publicly available land, hunting pressure, all those factors. But we certainly do want to, start a dialogue with industry and see if there's make sure that we understand where they're coming from, and if there's a way to work together to, bring them into the mix, and if there's a way to, make things more profitable for them, maybe not from spending by the average hunter, but just by economies of scale, trying to get volumes of hunters back doing relatively low cost things, but there may be some volume angles there that we can work on. But first we have to sort of agree that this is a problem that needs to be solved. That not all state agencies are that way.
Yeah, and kind of along that same direction, Ellen is making a good point. She said, I also think the shortage of 22 ammo for all those years really hurt small game hunters. I remember being in Walmarts all over and hearing grandfathers and dads lament that they had no ammo to go squirrel hunting. Maybe folks got out of that hunt and never came back. So I hadn't really considered that, but yeah, I mean, we were really limited on .22 ammo for a few years. And I wonder if that just kind of pissed people off and they swore it off, and maybe we could go after those people as a re-engagement strategy. Maybe that could be one of those modern multi-state grant proposals that we put in.
Well, that's certainly part of a pattern that we see in terms of, not that was sort of a unique situation with regard to the ammunition shortage, but certainly we've had game shortages in certain years, and we see that, hunting participation kind of bubbles along, and then it sort of drops down you're sort of going down the staircase. There are certain years where, hunting conditions are bad or whatever, and some proportion of hunters stop hunting and just don't come back for whatever reason. So it would be interesting to try to figure out how to either stop that from happening or how to get those folks back more effectively when they stop for a year.
Yeah, and maybe part of that is opening up some more space. So Ellen's first comment was actually about sometimes we're allowed to hunt deer in municipal spaces with archery equipment, and she wonders if it might be possible that we could open up spaces like that for archery hunting squirrel or rabbit too. I know that's maybe a little far-fetched. I don't know very many municipal areas that allow archery deer hunting, especially in the Northeast where there's just tons of people. Maybe out west that's a little easier to come by, but I haven't seen any pushes for that. Have you, Scott?
Not that I'm aware of, no. But again, here in the Midwest, we don't have as acute a problem there as you do in the East in terms of suburbanization.
Right. And then going back to some of the marketing stuff, Doug Burt made a good point. He's from Arizona. He said small game has a bad public image or no public image due to bucks and bulls dominating imagery of hunting. And that's a really good point. I know the Kentucky Rules and Regs book from last year had a squirrel on it, so that was pretty cool, and I know Illinois has in the past too. So maybe part of our marketing strategy should just be getting that imagery out there more. Have you guys talked about that at all?
Oh, not necessarily, but I would say I certainly agree that the public face of hunting, if you look at sort of the mass media, it is geared more towards big game at this point, and there are a few shows and events that are centered around small game, up on game, but certainly the big game hunting has the stage right now, and whether that's sort of self-perpetuating from a marketing standpoint, or is that just following what hunters want?
And I think that kind of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
So I think that kind of lends to maybe why hunting with dogs is pretty popular in small game, because although we don't see small game very often in media, we do see a lot of like bird dogs and squirrel dogs. And Matt Bartley from Utah makes a good point too, that I agree with. He says hunting dogs are a key part to some small game hunters, some say crucial to success. I think that's a significant barrier, perceived and actual. The cost, time, and money seem to be overlooked and underestimated for a dog. And I've definitely heard that. It's tough to pheasant hunt without a dog if you have to walk the fields all by yourself, and that can be really daunting. So what would you say about those maybe actual or perceived barriers to small game hunting with a dog? Has that come up in conversation?
Well, I've seen references to um, upland game hunting being perceived as sort of elitist at this point, and I don't know if that's
Okay.
because of um, the perception of people needing dogs and trailers and e-collars and all that, and
Mm-hmm.
um, certainly it it's that's the way some people and maybe a lot of people hunt upland game, small game at this point, but it's certainly not a requirement. And um, so I don't know to what extent that for sure that people perceive that as a barrier, that you need a dog and
Mm-hmm.
need a little, we can think through ways of communicating that message. Certainly squirrel hunting, you don't need a dog. And in this part of the country, people really don't have dogs to hunt squirrels with, or rabbits for that matter, for a large part. So it's sort of a regional thing as well, probably.
Okay, interesting. And Christina Malloy did chime in. She wants y'all to know that Whisper approved the use of funds for stocking of pen-raised birds for our 3 activities a couple of years ago if states included an evaluation component. And so if that's an issue for you guys who are listening in, if you would do this if you had an evaluation component, let us know. We at the council have all kinds of evaluation materials that we can share with you. If that's, a barrier to you guys doing these programs for small game and marketing small game. There is a lot of conversation going on in the chat box, which is awesome. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up, but I do want everybody to know that we will be holding a coffee talk on small game hunting and some of these issues brought up in the resolution on June 24th, which is a Wednesday at 2 p.m. And I will get an ad up on the community pretty soon so you guys can RSVP and start asking some questions there. These are some really great points. I think small game hunting could be the future of R3. Anything's possible at this point, and it is just way more accessible. So let's have some conversations about that. Take a couple weeks, think about what you've heard, read the resolution if you haven't already. Scott has provided his email for questions or comments, so get in touch with him if you'd like. And I just want to thank everybody for being here and participating. This was a pretty big group, so that's awesome. That makes me think that there's probably a lot of potential to do stuff with small game, especially with the modern multi-state grant stuff. So Scott, thank you so much for your time, and we hope to have you back for the coffee talk so we can have a little bit more of this discussion.
Absolutely. Again, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I think it's something that we need to talk about more, and I look forward to the 24th.
Definitely. Great. I hope everybody has a